All right. I think there's a long list of questions here, so let's start at the top. The first question says the assumption of perfect competition implies that A, individuals in the market accept the market price as given. B, individuals can influence the market price. C, the price will be fair. Or D, the price will be high. And so for this question, we're looking for what are the different assumptions or criteria for perfect competition. We know there's three major ones. The first one is that there are a very large number of sellers in this market. The second is that they're all price takers, which means nobody can really set or influence the market price. It is simply everybody taking the market price as it is given. And the third is that there are low barriers to entry or exit into this market. And so let's find which one of these answer choices is going to best match up with one of those assumptions. And A says individuals in the market accept the market price as given, and that seems to match up very well with our second assumption. So we're going to keep an eye on that one. B says that individuals can influence the market price, and we say that individuals cannot influence the market price, so this is going to be incorrect. C says the price will be fair, and we only say that the firms will be price takers, not that the firms will face a fair price. And so C is incorrect. And D says that the price will be high. And again, we only say that firms are price takers. We do not comment on whether or not the price they're taking is going to be high or low. So A is going to be the best answer here, and that's going to be the correct answer. And let's go to a previous year's answer, and they said, under perfect competition, price is determined by the intersection of market demand and market supply. The individual buyer and seller has to accept the price as determined by the market demand and market supply. In other words, individual sellers can sell as much as he wants, and individual buyers can buy as much as he wants at the price provided by the market. Thus, in the case of perfect competition, the individual buyer or seller takes the market price as given, hence the correct answer choice is A. Great, so we're on the same page there. B says monopolistic competition describes an industry characterized by a blank number of firms producing blank products with blank for firms. And A says small, identical, and barriers to entry. B says small, similar, and relatively easy entry. C says large, similar, relatively easy to entry. And D says large, identical, relatively easy entry. So we're basically defining monopolistic competition on three different criteria. First is the number of firms, second is the type of products, and first is the ease of entry, right? So we can break this down one by one. So first, in monopolistic competition, do we say that there are a large number of firms or a small number of firms? And the answer to that is we say that there's a large number of firms, right? That there are many firms just like in perfect competition. Okay, the second criteria is the types of products. And so this is where it can be either similar or identical products. And identical products is the same for perfect competition. And in this case, what we're dealing with in monopolistic competition is similar products. And that's one of the big differentiating factors between monopolistic competition and perfect competition, is that you're selling similar products that are slightly differentiated instead of identical products. Okay? And the third criteria is barriers of entry. Are they easy or are they high? And the answer to this, again, is that we say that there's relatively easy barriers to entry. There's relatively easy entry into this market, that there's very low barriers. And so off those three criteria, we have our definition of monopolistic competition, and we can start eliminating answer choices. So A and B both say a small number of firms, and we know we're looking for a large number of firms, so it's not A or B. And in C or D, one says similar and one says identical, and we said the answer here is similar. And so C is going to be the right answer. And again, we said relatively easy entry as well. So C is the correct answer here. That monopolistic competition describes an industry characterized by a large number of firms producing similar products with relatively easy entry for firms. Okay. And the previous tutor says that monopolistic competition is a market system that consists of a large number of firms producing somewhat different products which are close substitutes of each other. In other words, products of different firms of monopolistic competition are similar but not identical. Besides, there is freedom of entry and exit under monopolistic competition. Thus, monopolistic competition describes an industry characterized by a large number of firms producing similar products with relatively easy entry for firms. Hence, the correct option is C. Great. So we also match up with that. And it looks like they don't actually answer the rest of the questions, so we'll be answering the rest of the questions for them. and question 3 says Microsoft and its operating system are often cited as an example of a company that grew into a monopoly through A, ownership of a resource, B, patents, C, network externalities, or D, large economies of scale. And so this is going to require some background. I'm not an expert on Microsoft, but we can break down the answer choices into what they mean. So A says ownership of a resource, and so the way that ownership of a resource can make it grow into monopoly is if you're the only one that can really produce a resource or have access to an essential component of a resource, then that obviously sets you up to be a monopoly because everybody else has to come to you to get that input. I don't think that Microsoft falls under the category of a company that has grown into monopoly because they own a resource, right? Like when Microsoft developed an operating system, but that's not off of the ownership of a resource, that's off R&D, right? So that's not necessarily correct. Now B says patents, and what patents are is a government issued monopoly in exchange for the publication of how to produce a good to a public domain. And so patents are government regulated monopolies, right? And so I'm not exactly sure, but I don't believe that Microsoft and its operating system, I don't believe that those are patented as a whole. There might be components that are patented, and I also don't believe that that's the reason they grew into monopoly. That the only reason their OS was their dominant OS is because they have a patent in it. I think it has much more to do with some of the other factors that we'll see later on in this list of answer choices. C says network externalities, and so what this refers to is that if you're building a network, that ownership of the resource by one person increases the value of the ownership to everybody else. And so in the framework of an operating system, it makes things a lot easier when you use the same operating system as other people. There's a lot more cross-platform capabilities, there's a lot more data sharing available, a lot more tools that you can use. So if you have an operating system that a lot of other people use, then that makes that operating system more valuable. If only one or two people use this operating system, then it's not as valuable to the consumer. And so this is what we refer to as network externalities, and Microsoft and its operating system definitely do fall into a very good example of this idea of network externalities. So we'll keep an eye on that. And finally, D, large economies of scale. And so what economies of scale refers to is you increase production, that the cost of producing that good has gone down significantly. And so you benefit actually from increasing production. And so this is probably true, like Microsoft producing its operating system probably does benefit from large economies of scale. There's a very high upfront cost of developing an operating system. And after you develop, it's probably very low cost to sell the operating system to many different people. So as you increase production, the overall average cost of producing the operating system is going down. But I don't believe that that's the competitive advantage that Microsoft has over other OS developing companies, right? Like all OS, this is not the reason that they grew into monopoly, right? All companies that develop OSs are going to face large economies of scale by the very nature of the product that you're producing. It's merely that Microsoft was early to the market and has a very large user base that they are able to benefit off of network externalities to grow into that monopoly. It's not really that economies of scale issue. So network externalities is going to be the best answer here, and we can mark that as correct. So C is correct. Network externalities refers to when one person's ownership of a good increases the benefits to other owners. In the context of OSs, having many people use the same OS is beneficial in terms of ease of use. This contributed to Microsoft's monopoly. All right, next question, 4. Question 4 says, if all firms in an industry are price takers, then A, each firm can sell at the price it wants to charge, provided it is not too different from the price other firms are charging. B says each firm takes the market price as given for its current output level, recognizing that the price will change if it alters its output significantly. C says an individual firm cannot alter the market price even if it doubles output. Or D, the market sets the price and each firm can take it or leave it by setting a different price. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the criteria for perfect competition, right? But we said that if firms are price takers, then they have absolutely no sway or no control over the price in the market. They can very output all they want. They're not going to have any ability to change the price. And so everybody is facing the same price, and either you sell at that price or you leave the market, right? So which one of these answer choices fits that definition? A says each firm can sell at the price it wants to charge, provided it's not too different. And we said that's not true, right? You cannot sell at any price. You can only sell at one price, and that's the market price. So A is not correct. B says each firm takes the market price as given for its current output level, recognizing the price will change if it alters its output significantly. And we said, again, if you're a price taker, the price will not change even if you alter your output significantly. You have no market control or market power. So B is incorrect. C says that an individual firm cannot alter the market price even if it doubles output. And so this is much closer to our understanding of price-taking firms. We say that even if you double your output, that has no influence on the market price because you're a price taker. That fits with our definition, and so this seems to be a good answer. D says that the market sets the price and each firm can take it or leave it by setting a different price. And so it's true that firms can take it or leave it, but you can't leave it by setting a different price. You can just leave it by leaving the market. So D would be incorrect. So C is the correct answer here. An individual firm cannot alter the market price even if it doubles output. C is correct. Price-taking firms have no ability to change the price by varying output. This fits with this rationale explains why answer choice C would be true. Okay, number 5. Number 5 says, because of the existence of a large number of similar but not identical substitutes in most communities, the market for financial planners is best considered to be a monopoly, an oligopoly, perfect competition, or monopolistically competitive. So let's break it down between these 4 different types of market structures. A monopoly refers to when one producer dominates the market and is the only producer of the good. But in this case, and so they have complete market power and price setting power. But in this case, we say that the stem of the question says there's a large number of similar but not identical substitutes. So if there's a large number of similar but not identical substitutes, that basically means that there's a large number of sellers. And so that kind of destroys our ability to pick answer choice A, because A says there's only one seller. B is an oligopoly, and basically it says it's not that there's only one seller, there's only a few major sellers. And so again, this is still not going to be the right answer choice for the same reason that A isn't, because there's a large number of basically producers in this market. So a large number of producers, this will mean that we have to eliminate both monopoly and oligopoly. Now C says perfect competition, and we said we had that 3 criteria. And so we have a large number of sellers, that's true, but they sell similar but not identical substitutes. And so again, we know that is a really big differentiating factor between perfect competition and monopolistically competitive markets. Because in perfect competition, we expect there to be identical substitutes. So C is going to be incorrect. And finally, D, monopolistic competition. A large number of similar but not identical substitutes. And for that reason, we think that answer choice D is going to be a really good answer here for our question. So D is going to be the correct answer here because it fulfills that definition. D is correct. Monopolistically competitive markets have a large number of sellers with similar but not identical products. Great, and we can go on to question 6. I'm also going to grab some water really quickly, and I will be right back to pick up where we left off. Okay, let's go to question 7, I guess, because there's no question 6. 7 says De Beers became a monopoly by A, establishing control over diamond mines, B, economies of scale, C, technological superiority, or D, ownership patent. And I think De Beers is a diamond company, and so I think if my history or if my knowledge serves me correctly, then I believe that the answer choice here is actually going to be A, because they own a lot of the major diamond mines, and so they have control over certain resources that are inputs into the production of consumer diamonds. It's not really clear if there's economies of scale in the diamond mining business. I don't believe there's any technological superiority in this company's ability to produce diamonds, merely that they have more diamonds. And ownership patents, I don't believe you can't patent naturally occurring things, and so you can't. There's no patent. I don't know if ownership patent is even really a thing. So A is going to be the correct answer here. I'm going to do the answer choices, and we can type in question 7. A is correct. De Beers owns the inputs for diamonds, for consumer diamonds, because they own the diamond mines. This allows them to have a significant market share of the diamond market. Okay, question 8. We can see if we can put this over here to make it a little bit easier. So we're going to keep scrolling all over the place. How's this working? All right, question 8. The land that Scott owns has the only known source of aloe needed to make anti-itch lotion. In this case, Scott's monopoly results from A, government restrictions, B, location, C, sunk cost, or D, ownership of scarce inputs. And so A says government restrictions, and we don't really see any impact that government has in this situation set off by this question, right? Government doesn't really play a role, so it's not going to be A. B says location, and yes, it is location, but it is the specific. Maybe there's a better answer out there, right? Like technically, yes. Like if he didn't have the land where he has it, then he wouldn't have the monopoly. But maybe there's a more specific answer that there is out there. C says sunk cost, and this has nothing to do with anything related to this question. Sunk cost refers to the idea that the costs that have already been incurred shouldn't factor into decision making. Only the costs that will be incurred in the future compared to the benefits should be considered. And D says ownership of scarce resources. And so, again, this is probably a better answer than B for location, because the real reason that he owns monopoly is because he has the only access to the aloe that is an input into his anti-itch lotion. So he has the ability to have a competitive advantage there. So D is probably the best answer here. D is correct. Scott has the only known source of an input into this lotion, which gives him market power over that input and the secondary products. 9 says, in the long run, the firms consider all factors as fixed. In the long run, A says the firm considers all factors as fixed. B says that the firm considers all factors as variable. C says that production choices are more limited in the short run. And D says production is always greater than 0. So this is really just asking us the distinction between the short run and the long run. In the long run, the correct answer would be that the firm considers all factors as variable. And in the short run is defined by the point in time in which some of your factors are still fixed. It doesn't really have anything to do with production, so C and D are incorrect. It all has to do with the factors of the variable and fixed inputs or costs. And so one way we can view is an example of a fixed cost in the short run might be a 1-year lease on the building through which you run your business. And so in the short run, for that 1 year, that's a fixed cost. Even if you decide to produce nothing, you still owe payment on that fixed lease. In the long run, that cost becomes variable because in the long run, you're given enough time to back out of that lease or for that lease to expire, and you need to consider whether or not you want to renew it. And so that becomes a variable decision. And as you increase your output, that it might be the case that you would maybe want to incur even more fixed costs. Even more of these like variable costs of a more fixed nature in the short term, right? And so B is going to be the correct answer here. But in the long run, the firm considers all factors as variable. The long run is defined by the time in which all factors are variable. 10 says, when an increase in the firm's output reduces its long-run average cost, total cost, it achieves A, economies of scale, B, diseconomies of scale, C, constant returns to scale, or D, variable returns to scale. So basically this is referring to the idea of the relationship between output and long-run average total cost. And so economies of scale refers to a situation where as you're increasing your output, you're actually able to reduce your overall costs because this greater size of your production scale is allowing you to lower the costs overall. And so you might think of like an assembly line reducing the costs, average total cost of production compared to a car workshop where you produce everything by hand. When you've scaled up production to a scale of an entire factory, then the average cost might actually be lower than if you're hand building each car yourself. And so that's what we refer to as economies of scale. A is correct. Economies of scale is the definition of the scenario laid out in the question. 11 says, or there's no 11, 13. Most electric, gas, and water companies are examples of A, unregulated monopolies, B, natural monopolies, C, restricted input monopolies, or D, sunk cost monopolies. And so they're all monopolies. So the question is, which one of these is the correct type of monopoly? A says an unregulated monopoly, which is basically saying a monopoly that is allowed to exist without any government intervention or regulation. B says natural monopoly, which refers to the idea that some industries are so high barrier to entry that the market structure naturally lends itself to a natural monopoly, structure, and that it's really hard for there to be competition in these types of markets. C says restricted input monopolies. I've actually never really heard of a restricted input monopoly, so I'm not sure what that refers to. And D says sunk cost monopolies, and again, I'm not really sure what a sunk cost monopoly is. And so, because sunk cost doesn't really seem to be related to monopolies. So it is, however, going to be a natural monopoly, B. And the reason for that is we look at these utility companies that there's a lot of high barriers to entry in that if you want to provide electricity, you need to lay down power lines. If you want to provide gas, you need to lay down the gas pipes to give gas to each home. If you want to give a water company, you need to lay down the infrastructure to connect each of these houses to water. And the thing is, it only makes sense for one company to take care of that infrastructure. It wouldn't make sense for there to be 5 companies that are all laying down electric grids and you have 5 electric cables connected to your house, and then you get to pick between one of those 5 and the other 4 are useless. That's a really inefficient way and a really expensive way of looking at things. And no company is going to put down the money to do that, right? When they know that they won't even necessarily be rewarded for putting down those lines. So the natural type of market that these utilities are in lends themselves to a monopoly structure where if one company has already put down the infrastructure for electricity or gas or water, then it makes very little sense for another company to come in and try and do the same thing. And so it's naturally going to be oriented towards a monopoly structure. So 13 says B is correct. We say that for utility companies, the high barrier to entry is the cost of infrastructure to support the distribution of these utilities. If one company has already built that infrastructure, it's unlikely another company will try and come do the same thing. This structure lends itself, this market structure naturally lends itself to be a monopoly. Now 14 says, perfect competition is characterized by A, rivalry in advertising, B, fierce quality competition, C, the inability of any one firm to influence price, or D, widely recognized brands. And so what we're looking at here is this idea of perfect competition and its characteristics. And we know that there's three. A says rivalry in advertising. We know that in perfect competition, there's no benefit to advertising. There's no ability to differentiate one person's product from another, so advertising accomplishes very little. And consumers don't expect your advertisements to convince them to produce and to buy from one producer or another, because all the products are the same. So there's no rivalry in advertising and perfect competition, only in monopolistic competition. 2, B says fierce quality competition. And again, we're not dealing with a situation in which quality is differentiable in perfect competition. Everything is identical. The quality is identical. Consumers don't see any difference in terms of quality between good producers, and so there's no reason for there to be fierce quality competition. C says the inability of any one firm to influence price. And again, we said this before, this is one of the criteria for perfect competition. We say that all firms in perfect competition are price takers, and there's no market power for any individual firm. And so this seems to be a really good answer choice. And finally, D says widely recognized brands. And again, that happens more so with oligopolies or monopolistic competition, where you have some ability to differentiate one product from another. And so with perfect competition, without that ability to differentiate, there's no reason for there to be branding. So C is the best answer here. So we say C is correct. Firms in perfect competition are price takers, so they have no ability to influence price. Now 15 says the market for grade A large eggs in the state of California is best considered to be A, perfectly competitive, B, monopolistically competitive, C, an oligopoly, or D, a monopoly. And I'm gonna be honest, I know very little about the market for grade A grade A large eggs in the state of California. I actually don't know anything about that market structure. Now we can go down to the criteria. What do we think is going to be the case for a number of sellers in that market? Is it going to be large or small? And I would say when it comes to farming goods, there's usually a large number of sellers. Like if you look at wheat, we know there's a large number of wheat farmers. And so if you apply that logic to another form of food production, then we can say that maybe there's a large number of sellers in the state of California. So we can call that a large number of sellers. B, is there a difference between these products? And I mean, I guess you could go like cage-free versus organic versus commercial, but I think to most people, they don't really care about the type of eggs that they're buying. And also, like, it's not like the farmers are all differentiating based on whether or not their eggs are organic or free range, right? There's only like 3 or 4 different subtypes of eggs. And so we can say for the most part, they're probably identical. Like one farmer's eggs are identical to another farmer's eggs. And finally, ease of entry or exit into a market. And so do we think it's really hard to start growing eggs? And I would say it's probably not too hard. Like I know people who have chickens and can grow eggs at home. So it's probably hard to be a very wide or large producer, but it's probably not hard to enter a market or exit the market. So we can say that there's a large number of sellers as well. We can say that there's a low barrier to entry and exit as well. So if those are our 3 ways of analyzing it, then we would say that A is correct, perfectly competitive. It depends. We'll write that it depends on the details, which I'm not sure on. If we assume that there are a large number of egg farmers in the state, that eggs are largely identical, and that it's not hard to start an egg business in California, then we would say it's perfectly competitive, right? So that's our assumption. Again, don't take my word for this. This is just off of my knowledge. Maybe you guys have more knowledge about this than I do. C says 16. Market structures are categorized by which two criteria? A says the number of firms and the size of firms. B says whether or not products are differentiated and the extent of advertising. C says the number of firms and whether or not products are differentiated. Or D says the size of the firms and the extent of advertising. And so we can say here that this market structure is probably going to first definitely depend on the number of firms, right? The more firms there are, we can say it's either perfectly competitive or monopolistic competitive. The less, it's either oligopoly or monopoly. And then we also know that whether or not the products are differentiated or identical is a big factor, especially between perfect competition and monopolistic competition. And so C is going to be the best answer here because those are the criteria we often see ourselves using to differentiate between market structures. C is correct. Number of firms and product differentiation are extremely useful in categorizing market structures. 17 says, when a firm adds capital in the short run, workers will be A, less productive and let the machines do most of the work. B, be more productive because they have more equipment. C, will be at the same level of productivity. Or D, more productive at first and then less productive after a few weeks. And so this is basically saying what happens in the short run when we add capital. And most people would say that if we add capital, ability that wasn't there before, then workers will be more productive because they have more equipment that will increase their ability to be productive, right? And so 17 is most likely going to say answer choice B is correct. Capital makes workers more productive by increasing the ability of each worker to produce the good. For example, machinery in factories makes production easier for workers. 18 says, the market for soft drinks, which is dominated by Coke and Pepsi, is best considered to be A, perfectly competitive, B, monopolistically competitive, C, an oligopoly, or D, a monopoly. And so again, we said that Coke and Pepsi, if they're the dominant soft drink manufacturers, then that must mean that there are very few sellers in this market. So it's not going to be perfectly competitive or monopolistically competitive. But there's more than one producer, so it's not going to be a monopoly. Therefore, the answer must be an oligopoly. C is correct. There are a few major producers in the soft drinks market. This is the characteristic of a monopoly, of an oligopoly. 19 says an industry with a firm that is the only producer of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes and for which re-entry by potential rivals is prohibitively difficult is A, monopolistically competitive, B, a monopoly, C, an oligopoly, or D, perfect competition. And again, it seems like this is a very straightforward definition question. We said there's only one firm, only one producer of a good or service, no close substitutes. Entry is really difficult. That has to be a monopoly, right? So we say C is correct. This is the definition of a monopoly. And finally, 20, if a Florida strawberry wholesaler operates in a perfectly competitive market, that wholesaler will have X share of the market and consumers will consider her strawberries and her competitor's strawberries to be X. Therefore, X advertising will take place in this market. A says large, standardized, and no advertising. B says small, standardized, and little of any advertising. C says small, differentiated, and no advertising. And D says large, differentiated, and extensive advertising. And so if you're a Florida strawberry wholesaler in a perfectly competitive market, that must mean that there's a large number of sellers, and that means that each person's share of that market is going to be relatively small, right? You're splitting that market with a large number of sellers. Your share is small. And so A and D are eliminated. And then they say consumers will consider her strawberries and her competitor's strawberries to be what? it's either standardized or differentiated. And we say this is perfect competition, so all products are identical, so it must be standardized. And so B seems to be the only answer choice left. And then it says, therefore, advertising, little, if any advertising will take place in this market. And again, we say yes, because if there's no ability to differentiate between these two people's products, then there's no basis for advertising, right? You're not really, there's nothing to set you apart. And so B is going to be the best answer here. B is correct. In a perfectly competitive market, each firm has small market share, standardized, sells an identical or standardized product, and advertises very little. So that would be the correct answer. So here was our correct answer for all these questions. We're going to put this in. I think we're going to mark this as incorrect just because the rest of the questions have not been answered. So we want somebody to come in and kind of put this back in. But other than that, we're going to mark this as done. And then that seems to be all the questions we have today. So hopefully this was helpful. And other than that, I will see you guys again next week. And